Elara Vance felt the cold in her bones, a deep and invasive chill that had nothing to do with the late autumn air. It was a cold that had settled in her marrow the day she buried Arthur, her husband of 52 years, and it had refused to leave ever since. The old farmhouse, once a vessel of warmth and laughter that echoed with his booming voice, now seemed to conspire with the silence, its creaks and groans sounding like sighs of loneliness. It was a house built for a family, for noise and life, and in its current quiet, it felt cavernous and sad. She sat at the heavy oak table he had built with his own hands, his initials carved carefully into the underside, a secret they had shared. In her trembling fingers, she held the latest letter from the bank. The paper was crisp, official, and utterly without mercy. The words swam before her tired eyes, but their meaning was as sharp as broken glass. Foreclosure. Auction. Final notice. Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of the life they had built together on this sprawling patch of land. Arthur had made her promise. On his last day, his hand frail in hers, his voice a reedy whisper, he had looked at her with eyes that still held the spark of the young man she'd fallen for. "Keep the farm, Ellie," he had breathed. "Don't let them take it. It's our heart," she had promised, her own voice thick with unshed tears, a promise that now felt like a lead weight in her soul. How could she keep it? The medical bills had devoured their savings like a plague of locusts, leaving nothing but barren fields of debt behind. Outside, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a slate-gray canvas that promised a storm. The wind was picking up, rattling the window panes in their frames and whispering cruel things through the eaves. It was an early winter, the meteorologists had said, an unseasonable blast of Arctic air sweeping down from the north. For Elara, it felt fitting. The world outside was simply mirroring the desolate winter within her own heart. She traced the rim of her chipped porcelain mug, the coffee inside long gone cold. She had a little money left. Enough for a few more bags of flour, some coffee, and maybe some fuel for the generator if the power went out. Not nearly enough to placate the wolves from the bank. Mr. Thompson, the man whose name was printed at the bottom of the letter, had a voice as smooth and cold as river stone. He had spoken of market realities and financial obligations, words that meant nothing to a woman who measured her wealth in sunsets watched from the porch and the scent of rain on dry earth. The farm was more than land and a building. It was a living history of their love. The crooked fence post by the gate was where Arthur had first kissed her. The mighty oak by the barn was where their children had played, its branches holding the ghost of a tire swing. Every floorboard, every pane of glass, was imbued with a memory. Losing it would be like losing him all over again, a second, final amputation of her soul. The first flakes of snow began to fall. They were large and wet, clinging to the windows like desperate hands before melting into tears. Elara watched them, a profound sense of resignation settling over her. She was 82 years old. She was tired. The fight had gone out of her, leaving only a hollow ache of grief and failure. She had failed Arthur. The thought was a constant, bitter companion. As dusk began to bleed across the bruised sky, the snow intensified. It was no longer a gentle flurry but a driving, horizontal blizzard. The wind howled now, a mournful, hungry sound that seemed to want to swallow the little house whole. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into a deep, velvety darkness broken only by the faint, ghostly light of the snow-covered world outside. Elara sighed and pushed herself up from the table, her joints protesting with a chorus of creaks. She knew the routine. She found the oil lamps, her hands moving with the practiced ease of long habit, and soon a warm, flickering glow pushed back against the encroaching dark. The light was soft, kind. It made the room feel smaller, safer. But it couldn't keep the sound of the storm at bay. And it couldn't silence the louder storm raging inside her. It was then that she heard it. A sound that did not belong. Beneath the shriek of the wind, there was another noise. A low, guttural rumble, deep and mechanical. It grew louder, a discordant chorus of engines struggling against the elements. Headlights cut through the swirling curtain of white, 2 of them, then 4, then more than she could count. They were moving slowly, uncertainly, up her long, unpaved driveway. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her sorrow. She hurried to the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. In the swirling snow, she could make out shapes. Large, dark shapes. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. They looked like monstrous, wounded beasts, their chrome dulled by the snow, their engines coughing and sputtering. The lead bike slid to a halt just shy of her porch. Figures dismounted, huge men bundled in black leather that was already caked with a layer of white. They were giants, their faces obscured by beards and helmets, their forms bulky and intimidating. Arthur's voice echoed in her memory, a low warning he'd given her many times. "Lock the doors, Ellie. Don't talk to strangers out here. You can't be too careful." Her first instinct was to obey that ghostly command. To bolt the door, douse the lamps, and pray they would move on, that the storm would swallow them up and carry them away from her. Her hand was already on the heavy deadbolt when she stopped. Through the window, she saw one of the men take off his helmet. His hair and beard were flecked with ice. His face was raw and red from the wind, and when he breathed out, his breath plumed in a thick white cloud. He looked exhausted. He looked frozen. She saw another man stumble, his footing lost in a deep drift of snow. His friends caught him, holding him up. They were not monsters. They were men. Men caught in a dangerous storm, far from shelter. Her own problems, the foreclosure, the loneliness, suddenly seemed small in the face of the immediate, life-or-death reality of freezing in a blizzard. Her grandmother's words came to her then, a different voice from the past, one of gentle strength. "When you can help, you help. It doesn't matter who they are. A soul in need is a soul in need." The deadbolt felt heavy under her hand. For a moment, 2 ghosts wrestled for her will, her husband's caution and her grandmother's compassion. The wind shrieked, and she saw the men huddle together for warmth, their broad shoulders slumped against the onslaught. Compassion won. With a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, Elara turned the lock and pulled the heavy door inward. A blast of wind and snow tore into the warmth of her kitchen, making the lamp flames dance wildly. The men on the porch turned as one, their surprise visible even in the dim light. "You can't stay out here," she called out, her voice thin but clear against the gale. "You'll freeze to death. The barn's warm and dry. You can take shelter in there." The man who had taken his helmet off, clearly their leader, stared at her for a long moment. He was a mountain of a man, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and a long, gray-streaked beard. His eyes, deep-set and dark, held a mixture of suspicion and exhaustion. He looked from her small, frail form to the sturdy, dark shape of the barn just beyond the house. The barn, his voice was a low rumble, like gravel being poured onto a road. "It's clean," she said, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "And it'll keep the wind off you. Come on, before you're all buried out here." He gave a curt nod to his men. Without another word, they began the slow, arduous process of pushing their heavy machines through the deepening snow toward the shelter of the barn. There were 30 of them in total. 30 strangers with hard faces and leather jackets adorned with patches she couldn't read in the dark. Elara's heart still hammered, but a strange sense of rightness settled over her. This was the right thing to do. Once they were all inside the massive structure, stamping the snow from their boots and shaking the cold from their limbs, Elara returned to her kitchen. She didn't have much, but she would give what she could. She lit the old wood-burning stove, its familiar warmth a comforting presence. From the pantry, she retrieved the last of the beef stew Arthur had loved so much, a huge pot she had frozen weeks ago, unable to bring herself to throw it out. It felt right to use it now. She put the largest kettle she owned on to boil and ground the last of her good coffee beans. The rich aroma filled the small house, a scent of comfort and normalcy in a world gone mad. While the stew heated, she gathered every spare blanket she owned, thick wool ones from the cedar chest, old quilts her mother had made, even the Afghan from the back of Arthur's favorite armchair. Her arms laden, she braved the storm again, battling her way to the barn. The wind tore at her, but she pushed on. Inside, the men had used their lighters to see, creating small pockets of flickering light. The air was thick with the smell of wet leather, gasoline, and cold. They fell silent as she entered, watching her with those same guarded eyes. She set the blankets down on a clean bale of hay. "It's not much," she said, her voice breathless from the wind. "But they're warm. I'm heating up some stew and coffee. I'll bring it out when it's ready." The leader stepped forward. "Ma'am, you don't have to do that." "Nonsense," she replied, with a flash of the stubbornness that Arthur had always teased her about. "It's a bad night to be hungry and cold. My name is Alara." He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Spade," he said, by way of introduction. "We're grateful for the shelter, Alara." She returned to the house and, over the next hour, ferried out the steaming pot of stew, a stack of bowls, and the enormous kettle of coffee. The men ate in near silence, but with a hunger that spoke of a long, hard day on the road. They were respectful, taking care not to spill anything on the clean straw, passing the bowls and mugs with a quiet efficiency. They were a brotherhood, that much was clear. They moved and acted with an unspoken understanding. As they finished, Spade approached her again. He reached into his leather vest, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a thick roll of cash. "For the food and the trouble," he said, holding it out. Alara looked at the money, then back at his face. She shook her head. "No, ma'am, we pay our way. My grandma always said that kindness doesn't have a price tag," she insisted. "You were in trouble. I helped. That's all. You put that away." He studied her, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to see right through her. Finally, he put the money back in his vest. From another pocket, he pulled a small, worn patch of cloth. It was black, with an embroidered silver spade in the center. He pressed it into her hand. "Then take this," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's a marker. It means you're a friend to the club. If you ever need anything at all, you show this to one of us." She looked down at the small piece of fabric in her palm. It felt strangely heavy. "I don't imagine I'll ever need to," she said softly. "But thank you." She left them to rest and returned to her own cold, empty house. That night, for the first time in months, she did not feel entirely alone. The presence of 30 souls in her barn, however intimidating they might appear, was a strange comfort against the raging storm. She slept, for the first time since Arthur's passing, without dreaming. The next morning, the world was transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of deep, heavy snow under a sky of brilliant, painful blue. When she looked out, the bikers were already preparing to leave, digging their machines out of the drifts. They had stacked the blankets neatly by the barn door and cleaned up every trace of their presence. Spade met her on the porch as she stepped out into the blindingly bright morning. He handed her the empty stew pot and the kettle. "Thank you, Alara," he said. And in the clear light of day, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't there the night before. Respect. Deep and genuine. "Godspeed," she said simply. He nodded, then turned and walked back to his bike. With a coordinated roar that sent a flock of birds scattering from a snow-laden tree, the 30 engines came to life. They rode out one by one, a disciplined column of black and chrome against the stark white of the snow, until the last bike disappeared over the hill and the silence returned, deeper than before. Weeks crawled by. The snow melted, then returned, then melted again in the fickle dance of a changing season. The memory of the bikers began to feel like a dream, a strange interlude in her slow, quiet march toward ruin. The foreclosure notice on her mantelpiece was no dream. It was a stark, daily reminder of her failure. The auction date was circled in red. December 5th. She tried not to look at it, but it drew her eye like a wound. She had spent her days in a fog of quiet despair, going through the motions of a life that felt hollowed out. She cleaned the house. She tended to her small flock of chickens. She sat on the porch and watched the sun set, painting the sky in colors she no longer had the heart to appreciate. Hope was a foreign country she had no passport for. The small patch Spade had given her sat in a dish on her bedside table. She would sometimes pick it up, the rough embroidery a tangible link to that strange night. A marker, he'd called it. But what good was a marker when your whole world was about to be washed away by a tide of legal papers and financial ruin? It was a kind gesture, nothing more. A souvenir from a night of impossible charity. December 5th arrived, cold and gray. The air had a damp chill that promised more snow. Elara dressed in her Sunday best, a simple black dress that felt appropriate for a funeral. And that's what it was. The funeral for her home. Mr. Thompson was due to arrive at 10 o'clock with the county sheriff to formally evict her and oversee the auction of her life's possessions. She sat in Arthur's rocking chair on the porch, a wool blanket wrapped around her frail shoulders, and waited. She would not cry. She would not give that man the satisfaction. She would face the end with the same quiet dignity she had tried to live her life with. She would be a Vance until the very end. At 9:45, she heard a sound. It was a low, distant hum, a vibration she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. It was not Mr. Thompson's sensible sedan. This was different. Deeper. It grew steadily, a ground-shaking rumble that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The windows of the farmhouse began to vibrate gently. The chickens in their coop grew agitated, their clucking turning frantic. Elara gripped the arms of the rocking chair, her knuckles white. She leaned forward, peering down the long country road that led to her farm. And then she saw it. Over the crest of the hill, a single headlight appeared. It was followed by 2 more, fanned out beside it. Then a dozen. Then 50. A wave of light and chrome spilled over the horizon, an endless river of steel and thunder that flooded the landscape. It was a sight so vast, so overwhelming, it defied belief. Motorcycles. Not 30 this time. Hundreds. It looked like an army on the move. They filled the road from shoulder to shoulder, a disciplined, roaring tide of black leather and gleaming metal. They rode with a purpose that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Her distant neighbors, what few there were, appeared at their windows, their faces masks of shock and fear. Someone was probably calling the police, reporting an invasion by a barbarian horde. Elara remained frozen in her chair, unable to process what she was seeing. The rumble became a deafening roar as the vanguard of the column turned into her driveway. They didn't stop. They fanned out across her front lawn, across the fallow fields, parking their machines with a military precision that was breathtaking. They formed a vast, silent crescent around her house, their engines idling in a deep, menacing chorus. Row upon row of them, stretching back as far as she could see. 500 bikes. Maybe more. The engines cut out in a staggered, rolling silence, leaving a quiet so profound it felt louder than the noise it replaced. 1,000 leather-clad legs swung over saddles. 1,000 boots hit the dirt. And 500 men stood beside their machines, their faces turned toward her porch, waiting. Silent. Still. From the center of the front rank, a path opened. Spade walked through it, his stride unhurried, his expression as serious as a judge's. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps and looked up at her, his dark eyes holding hers. "You didn't use the marker, Elara," he said, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact. I didn't know how," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't think, you didn't have to," he interrupted gently. "One of our prospects, the young one you gave a second bowl of stew to, he has family in this county." He heard talk. About this farm. About the bank, he gestured to the silent army behind him. Word travels fast. A debt was owed. We came to pay it. Tears finally broke free, tracing hot paths down her wrinkled cheeks. I don't understand. There's nothing you can do. Just then, a sleek black car pulled up at the end of the driveway, blocked by the wall of motorcycles. Mr. Thompson got out, his face a mixture of impatience and anger, followed by a nervous-looking sheriff's deputy. What in God's name is going on here? Thompson demanded, striding forward. Clear these people out of the way. This is a legal foreclosure. He stopped dead when he saw the sheer scale of the gathering. His arrogant bluster evaporated, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed fear. He looked from the sea of grim-faced bikers to the small old woman on the porch, his mind clearly unable to connect the two. Spade didn't even turn to look at him. He nodded to a man standing beside him, a man in a sharply tailored suit who did not look like he belonged in this company. The man stepped forward, holding a briefcase. Are you Mr. Thompson, of County National Bank? The lawyer asked, his voice crisp and professional. Thompson swallowed hard. I am. And you are? I represent the financial interests of the Iron Spade Motorcycle Club, the lawyer said calmly. He opened his briefcase. As of 9:15 this morning, my clients have purchased in full the outstanding mortgage on this property, held by one Alara Vance. Here is the cashier's check for the principal and all associated fees, and the legally filed transfer of lien. Your business here is concluded. He held out the papers. Thompson stared at them as if they were venomous snakes. He looked at the check, his eyes widening at the amount. He looked at the 500 silent men watching his every move. He looked at the deputy, who seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible. Spade finally turned his head slowly to face the banker. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 1,000 engines behind it. This farm belongs to Alara Vance. She is a friend of the club. Which means this land, and this woman, are under our protection. If you or your bank ever bother her again, we will consider it a personal matter. He let the words hang in the cold air. Now get off her property. Mr. Thompson's face was ashen. He snatched the papers from the lawyer's hand, turned without a word, and practically ran back to his car. The deputy gave a weak, apologetic shrug toward Alara and followed him. The car reversed hastily and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the assembled men. The tension broke. Spade turned back to Alara, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. That's the first part of the debt, he said. Then he raised his voice. All right, boys. You have your assignments. Let's get to work. The army came to life. It was not an army of war, but of creation. Men swarmed toward the barn, carrying tool belts and lumber. A team with ladders and shingles headed for the roof of the house. Another group began chopping and stacking a mountain of firewood that would last her 5 winters. A large van pulled up, and men began unloading box after box of groceries, filling her empty pantry and freezer to bursting. They worked with the same silent efficiency they had shown in the barn weeks ago. They were roofers, carpenters, electricians, plumbers. Veterans and tradesmen. They repaired the crooked fence, replaced the rotting porch steps, and gave the entire house a fresh coat of paint. They worked all day, a symphony of hammers, saws, and quiet commands. Alara sat on her porch, wrapped in a new, thick blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, a mug of hot coffee someone else had pressed into her hands, and watched them. She watched these intimidating, tattooed men rebuild her world. They were repaying her small kindness, a bowl of stew and a dry place to sleep, with a tidal wave of goodness that left her breathless. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, the work was done. The farm looked loved again. It looked strong. It looked like the place she had shared with Arthur, full of life and promise. Spade came to her one last time. He stood before her, his helmet in his hand. The house is sound. The pantry is full. The deed is in your name, free and clear. The debt is paid, she said, her voice choked with emotion. How can I ever thank you? You already did, Elara, he said simply. That night. You looked at a bunch of rough, cold strangers and you didn't see a threat. You saw people who needed help. Not many would do that, he reached out and gently patted her hand. You rest easy now. No one will ever trouble you again, he turned and walked back to his bike. A signal was given, and once again, the earth began to tremble as 500 engines roared to life. It was not a sound of menace anymore. It was a chorus of protection. A salute. They filed out as they had come in, a disciplined river of steel, until the last taillight vanished over the hill. Elara Vance stood on the porch of her saved home, the cold finally gone from her bones, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. She was not alone. She had family. A loud, loyal, leather-clad family of 500 angels on iron horses. She held the small, worn patch in her hand and knew that the truest currency in the world was not money, but kindness. A debt had been paid, but a gift had been given, one that would last for the rest of her days. Paid in full.